This is Greg Pass with the Americans in Wartime Experience. Today's date is June the 2nd, 2023, and I am at World War II weekend in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I have the pleasure to sit down with Maurice James. Thank you for coming up to the trailer and talking with us today.
Thank you, Greg.
So, Maurice, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where were you born?
All right, I was born in Trenton, New Jersey. I grew up in the inner city. At that time, it was a pretty nice place to grow up. My parents had a delicatessen. We lived over top of the delicatessen, and I worked in the delicatessen from about 5 years old on. At 10 years old, I had my own paper route. By 12 years old, I had 200 customers. Just a basic, I think, relatively normal growing up in the 50s, experience. Had two sisters, one older, one younger. They became my employees on the paper route because there was too many to cover at one time. I went to Catholic school for 16 years, elementary school, high school, and St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. I graduated from college in 1967 with a degree in history, and I was an elementary school teacher teaching 6th grade. My first day of teaching, I was called for my Army physical. I obviously passed the physical. They let me finish teaching that year. About 2 or 3 days after the end of the school year, I was drafted.
So, we back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
Your father, grandfather, any military vets?
Sorry. Yes, my grandfather was in World War I, but he never left New York City because he could type before he was in the Army, and so he ended up typing in New York. That was my grandfather. My father was in the Army, in the infantry in France. He was a Jeep driver. He ended up with the rank of E5, and he did also get a Purple Heart.
So you mentioned you were involved in the Army before you got drafted, so you volunteered? Or
Well, no, I was drafted, but I then, in those days, even though you were being drafted, you could volunteer for the Army, and supposedly that would get you better assignments, whatever. It obviously didn't work. So anyway, no, the minute I was being drafted, I changed over to volunteering.
Gotcha. All right, so where'd you go to basic?
I went to basic training in Fort Dix, New Jersey, which was only about 30, 40 miles from where I lived outside of Trenton.
And AIT, what was your
AIT, infantry, and I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana. From Fort Polk, I went back. While I was in Fort Polk, now you have to realize this was really getting towards the end of the war, but in 1968 the war was at its height, and so they were short people. That's basically why I was drafted. I always say it was the bottom of the barrel. But by the time I got to Fort Polk, at the end of that, it was obvious I would be going straight to Vietnam. They were so short NCOs, they had created an NCO school, non-commissioned officer school, which was at Fort Benning, Georgia. It was the exact same school as officers training, but it was 4 weeks shorter. I always get asked the question, well, with a degree, why didn't you just go be an officer? You had to extend for another year. You had to stay in for 3 years rather than 2. I really wasn't a military-minded person. In this day and age, I don't like to tell it, but I really am not a big fan of guns. So anyway, I did volunteer for NCO school because it kept me in the States a little bit longer. And I finished NCO school in sometime in early spring of 1969. And from NCO school, they sent you to, as a part of a training officer group, to a basic training. So I went back to Fort Dix. There were about 15 or 16 of us out of the school that went to Fort Dix as as E5s, sergeants. Unbeknownst to any of us, they were really rating us while we were there, and they would pick one, theoretically the highest ranked one, and make them an E6. And that's how I got to be E6 in less than a year.
So were you in training the entire time from an enlistment to this E6?
Yes.
That is incredible. I've never heard of that.
Except, at the end, I was a training officer at Fort Dix.
Yeah, but you never had like an assignment at a full.
No.
So you're in training from E1 all the way to E6.
And that was all in less than a year.
That's
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah.
And then this was
Particularly seeing how I'm coming out of a classroom
yeah.
with no background
So
at all.
68 to 69 is happening.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I never heard of that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you finally get done with training.
Got done with training in June as an E6. In July, after I guess a leave, I shipped right off to Vietnam, straight in. And
what unit were you in when you shipped out?
I was in the first platoon, 5th of the 46th, blah 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 blah. First platoon sergeant. Now.
Of what division?
The 198th Infantry Division.
So probably brigade, but of the American division.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
Now, what was kind of, what made the job a little bit more difficult than it should have been was that I was shipped in, made this platoon sergeant and by the way, we didn't have a lieutenant, so you were actually platoon leader. You were everything.
No pressure.
And no experience, obviously, other than. But what made it a little bit more difficult, I didn't know any of these people. I'm the only one that is shipped to this unit at this time. I get there one day, the next day we go directly to the field. So
this unit had been in country for a bit.
Oh yeah, but and they had been shot up quite a bit. So while there were a handful that were well experienced, that probably the 6 months before I got there, it was a revolving door. People kept getting, wounded, sick, whatever, out.
How old were you?
Well, because I had already graduated from college, I was 24 at the time.
You're the old man.
I'm the old man.
So let me ask you this. I joke about you're the old man because it's
No,
that's the old man. But
yes.
In reality, 24 is not that old. What's it like being a 24-year-old kid with this? You're an E6 with incredible responsibility, and you're going into the environment where some of the guys have a lot of experience, and it's
some of it, yeah, and
what's that like?
Everything turned out really well. It was a great bunch of guys, but to me they were all kids. They were like fresh out of high school, and here I am, 2 years already out of college. But they were a great bunch of kids. There were a couple that had been there a while, and they had actually been acting platoon sergeant because they didn't have a platoon sergeant and they didn't have an officer, which there was a little bit of resentment there, so I had to finesse that. But in general, basically, I was in a daze, to be honest with you. And I kind of had to pretend I knew what I was doing when I didn't know what I was doing.
Were you married at the time?
No. And I had not met my wife yet. And I found that a blessing because a lot of the guys that I was with that had wives or girlfriends back home, it would wear on them. They'd get letters, and guys getting Dear John letters. So you had to deal with that while you're out marching around the field getting shot at. I always explain the experience as it was life-changing. It was one that I'm glad that I went through it because I survived, but I'd never want to have to do it again. And I said that from the day I got out. That's not my age. That's
How'd you get over there?
On a great big airplane. I think it was not a military airplane. It was full of Army guys, but it wasn't. It was just a regular, a regular passenger airplane.
So what was your first impressions when you got off the plane with temperature?
Well, yeah, I will never forget stepping out the door. Two things: the heat and the smell, and it was something that never left you the whole time you were there.
What was the smell like?
It like just hit you in the face, and it was something I'd never experienced before. It almost made you throw up. I mean, it was really like soup that hit you. I mean, obviously you get used to it after a while. That was July.
July of '69.
Yep. When I flew, I ended up flying into July. Now I don't know whether I had to go someplace first or not, because it was all boom boom. But I was in July at a big base camp for like 3 or 4 days. They called it acclimation to the climate, etc. The first night I was there, we took in a lot of mortars, and they hit a lot of barracks, and there were a lot of guys killed.
Where was this at?
This was in July.
No, when? Where? Excuse me, in Vietnam was this?
I'm sorry. I'm saying
Location.
July, Da Nang,
Okay.
that area.
Okay.
So that was kind of my first experience, with war. But at least it was a little bit farther away. But I can remember walking over and seeing all the barracks that were blown up. But I was only there 3 or 4 days. But I was there the 4th of July, and on the 4th of July they had a big concert and band, but there were thousands. I can remember just a sea of people. It was just like my father being in World War II. He always wanted to watch the Bob Hope stuff. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but it was that's what it was. I mean, it was just a field of guys. It was at night. It's the 4th of July, and it's all patriotic songs and all that stuff.
Was Bob Hope there?
No, but Bob Hope did come to Vietnam when I was in the field, and I think that was around Christmas time, which would be Christmas time of '69. Because I was the platoon sergeant, I did have a lieutenant at that time, and he gave me a ticket to see it, and I gave it to my RTO and let him go. And I can remember we were somewhere on a perimeter, and we listened to it on the radio. But it was kind of interesting, because every year my father always wanted to watch that when it was on TV.
So you're there for a few days getting acclimated, and then at some point you're married up with your platoon.
Right.
How far away from Da Nang was that?
Well, it was another airplane ride. From Da Nang we went to Chu Lai, which was the biggest base on the north, and then we must have gone in jeeps. I don't remember any buses. But as I say, I was the only guy going to this unit, and that was it was called LZ Gator, and that was really, at that time, it was the hub of the Americal division. So it was division headquarters. As I say, that was around the 5th or 6th of July, and I was only there one day, and they had us pack up our gear and get out on the helipad and shipped us out to the field. So, as I say, that unit had a really bad year. Of course, Tet was that January. So there was a lot, and that was the main route, like Ho Chi Minh Trail, from the north going south. So we were mostly on the coast. It was called the Peninsula, but it was in Nang Tri province, and we did go inland from time to time, but most of it was right around it. I'm sure you're familiar with My Lai.
Yes, Damascus.
Yeah, I was there a year after that happened in the village of My Lai, and that's where that was. I've since learned only through my own research, that that was one of the heaviest areas in Vietnam where they used Agent Orange. And I did see quite a bit of that. I never saw it being dropped, at least that I knew of, but I did see a lot of the remnants. I mean, it literally destroyed any vegetation that it would touch. So
you're infantry.
Yes.
Again, understanding that some people that might watch this might not have a military background.
Sure.
Can you explain what an infantry platoon does? And I assume you guys would go on patrol. So
yes.
Basic concept of what you were doing.
All right. Yeah, we were a search and destroy mission. That was our mission. So we basically walked around during the day. At night, we would set up ambushes. The best way to explain it, which is hard to understand, is we basically walked around in circles. You didn't take land and keep land. You were trying to keep what you had free of, quote, the enemy. So we didn't. Every once in a while, we'd run into an ambush where we would be hit, and we'd hit back. The very first month I was there, which was July, we went to the field with probably about 32 men, and we came back at the end of the month with 8.
Wow.
Now, they weren't all killed, but they were either wounded, killed, had to leave for malaria, whatever. So thank goodness that was my worst experience. After that, things calmed down and got a little better. There were some military reasons why that happened, which I could go into. But as I say, that was this unit's experience for the whole year before that. So it was just an extension of that.
I still can't get over the fact that you're pretty much green behind the
Yes.
ears. Are you the one that's responsible for doing the land navigation, or do you have
Yes.
guys? And how was your land nav skills?
I wasn't bad. I was pretty good. Now, again, I mean, I don't know. I think the training was good.
Yeah.
I mean, I could read a map. I could use a compass. I was pretty sure that when I said, this is where we are, this is where we are. And you had to be careful because sometimes you'd be calling in airstrikes. I do remember one time where we went out on a patrol, and it was just a small group of us, and we started to set up, and we were calling in some airstrikes, and I just had a feeling I was in the wrong place, and so I moved this right before the airstrikes, and the airstrikes were where we were.
Wow.
So, I mean, I don't know why, but that's why that happened. I don't know, so many things fly through my head.
Do you mind me asking a personal question?
No, you can ask anything you want.
You're a man of faith?
Yes.
Do you think that plays a role?
Absolutely.
Do you have something like that happen?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, not just that, but the whole, you asked me about how I felt, getting there and all that. You had to have something to hold on to.
Yeah.
And, I'm not a big one for showing it or anything. It's more internal to me. But I truly put my faith in God and said, you put me here. You either want me to get home or you don't want me to get home. But I've always felt very strongly that there was a reason why I came home. And all my life since then, I've tried to find reasons and things to do to justify that. Like for many years, I was a platelet donor. That has nothing to do with the military, but platelets are the things in your blood that help it coagulate. So particularly for kids that are this is years ago now, that were being treated with cancer, they had a lot of trouble as their blood wouldn't coagulate, and they literally turned black and blue, and they'd bleed to death internally. For many years, I went to the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. Now, at that time, it took over 3 hours to give platelets because they stuck you with both arms, and they took the blood out of one arm and it went through a centrifuge. The white blood cells and the red blood cells separate, and in the middle there's this little rim of what looks like whipped cream, but it's the platelets. They suck them out, and then they put that blood back in you. And they had to do that 8 times to get 1 pint of platelets. And over the years, I gave over 5 gallons of platelets. So that was a big, but that I digress from the military story. But I mean, that's an example. I'm basically volunteered for a lot of things and did a lot of things, and worked, different organizations. I mean, I was on the school board. I was on the planning board of the town. I was a small town, so we did a lot of things like that.
So you mentioned your training. You thought was pretty good. It's one thing to train, and then there's another thing to have to perform a task under a great amount of stress. Land navigation is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Did you find that the training took over and you just relied on the training, or were there
the training
step back, take a deep breath?
Yeah, the training took over to a certain extent, but as I said, I was the only new guy, so I relied on the guys that were there and had the on-ground experience. Yeah. And they, even though they were kids, they knew what they were doing, and they had seen a lot of, a lot of war before I got there. So they were very good. I had good RTOs. Now,
you say RTO, you're talking about
radio telephone operator. Now, I don't know, I assume you've interviewed so many people. In those days, the radio telephone operator carried a big, heavy battery radio on their back, along with all their other crap. And they also could not leave your side because they had a telephone receiver that was connected by a wire. So they'd hand you the phone and you'd have to talk back, particularly if you ran into an ambush, you'd be talking to people, whatever. So you got to be pretty close to that person. I mean, they camped with you, they were with you 24 hours a day. I had several very good ones that were experienced. My very first one, we were only in the field maybe 10 days, and we walked into an ambush. And at that time, I did have a lieutenant, but that lieutenant got hit, and it was his RTO, and my RTO got hit. I'll tell you that story in a little bit. But so as a consequence, we didn't have a lieutenant, and we only had one RTO, so he became my RTO. But he had been the lieutenant's RTO, so he was pretty well experienced, and he'd been there several months. So that helped. I mean, there was no such thing as rank. I mean, really, you talk. I mean, obviously because I was the sergeant, they'd first, but I'd ask questions and they'd ask. I mean, it was, and it really everybody knew that you were there to keep you and your buddies alive. That was the main goal. It really wasn't to shoot anybody or anything. I mean, that might sound kind of ridiculous, but if you had to, you did. But you were really doing it so you didn't get hit. And so as I say, they were all experienced, and I learned quite a bit from them real early on. As I said, that first month our unit got hit really hard. One of the reasons why we got hit very hard is we did have, after the first lieutenant got hit, we were assigned a lieutenant who was totally green, had never seen any combat, basically had been a desk jockey, and he didn't know what he was doing. And we kept walking into things and getting things. By the end of that month, which was July, they actually brought another lieutenant out, another captain rather, out, and relieved him in the field, took him out. I can remember one night we were setting up a perimeter, and of course we knew there were enemies out there, and he was going around from foxhole to foxhole, which was basically one of his jobs, and my job was to keep my platoon, but his was to go through the whole unit. And he was asking, now I had only been there 2 weeks. He was asking each one of us, well, what do you think we should do? I don't know what to do. And here we are. Oh my God.
Yeah.
So anyway, that.
How young was he, you think?
He was not that young. That was the strange part. He should have had more experience than he did, but somehow he had never been in the field before. When I say not that young, he wasn't as young as we are. He was maybe 30.
Yeah.
I don't know. He could have been young. Again, I say this is all documented in the book, and the lieutenant colonel that wrote the book got all of his data from Army records. So this is all legit. But it goes day by day, and he covers every unit.
You mentioned the book, but it was before we were filming, so now
Okay.
What's the name of this?
The name of the book is Our War, and there's a subtitle which I don't really remember. I'm trying to think. Taylor. It was by Lieutenant Colonel Taylor.
It's about the 198th.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit. So you sounds like you had a taste of some form of combat right at the airfield when they had that. But
Yes.
what was your first experience with small arms fire in the field? Was
Okay.
that day one, day two?
It was. Well, I had a couple experiences before I actually had incoming combat, which left an impression. It was only about a week we were in the field, and we were in this little village, and we were going to run patrols at night out of the village. It was a friendly village, everything was fine. And one of my soldiers came to me, and he asked me if he could go fishing. Well, I didn't think anything of it, it's fine. We were right on the water. And so I said yes. And about half an hour later, I hear this explosion. Here, what he meant by going fishing was they went out with a native, with a Vietnamese, in these little boats. I called them pea boats. I mean, they were really tiny little circle things. But they would use grenades. They'd pull the pin on the grenade, hold it, and throw it in the water so the fish would fly up. Well, he literally blew himself up.
Oh, no.
And as I say, I was only there a week. And they came to me and they said, well, you're the platoon sergeant. Technically, you should identify the body, but you don't have to. We'll get somebody else. I said, no, if it's my responsibility, I should do it. And I did. So that was my very first taste of casualty. And so obviously that left an impression on me. And then 3 or 4 days later was when we walked into this ambush. So that's when we first got shot at. One of the advantages of being an E6 and not an E5 was that as the platoon sergeant, when you went on patrols, you walked in the back. The E5s, many times, if their squad was picked, you were a squad leader, then you were the point on front. So that was a large advantage that I had getting out of NCO school and being an E6 going over there. So anyway, and I have to preface this with a little bit. It was very early in the morning. We were helicoptered in, and I do want to talk about that later too, to this area, and we were setting up to go on this patrol. And of course, whenever they did that, it was because there had been some kind of intel that there were gooks running around or, in the area. That's why we were there. We were search and destroy. My RTO at the time, this is before I got the lieutenant's RTO, because this is the day it all happened. We only knew each other about a week, but he literally was a kid. He was like 17 years old. And he was really a nice kid and really good. And we're setting up, and he keeps saying to me, I really don't like this place. I really want to get out of here. And I talked him down, and I said, look, it's fine. We're gonna be moving out shortly. Don't worry about anything. So we started to move out, and about 5 minutes out, our point got hit. He was experienced, but he got shot in the leg. It went up it went up his whole leg and came out up top. The lieutenant was up there. He got hit. And of course, when that happened, it's like all hell breaks loose. You know, everybody starts shooting and everything. And of course, the whole formation just shatters and you go everywhere. Well, sure enough, somehow my RTO got separated from me and he got hit. And when he got hit,
For a second time.
no, this is for, no, the one I was talking about before was the point man.
Gotcha.
We were in the back.
Okay.
But when everything shatters, you know, and there's bullets flying
Yeah.
every which way, and somehow he got separated. I to this day, I don't know how that happened, because as I say, we were always together. He got hit, and it didn't appear that he was that badly hurt. He was shot in the arm. And of course, at first I couldn't find him. And when I found him and he was hit, we applied first aid, the medic, worked all this, and we're still taking fire. This was going on for well over half an hour, and the medics wouldn't come in, and there was actually a colonel or somebody flying around up top, and I'm on the phone screaming and yelling at him to come down and get these guys, and they wouldn't come down. Finally, they did come down and get them. And during this whole time, I'm holding my RTO in my arms and keep talking to him because he was going into shock, and we did everything we could. And I really didn't think that he was hurt that bad, and got him on the helicopter. And that usually, if you could get them on the helicopter when they were still alive, you increased the chances that they'd be all right. So we didn't really know too much about it until several hours later, and he did die on the helicopter. And they said there was nothing they could do because the bullet went through the arm in his chest and lodged in his heart. So that was then, in less than 2 weeks, I lost 2 guys right off the bat. So that was pretty upsetting. But as I say, and then that was around the 23rd of July. We then went on several different operations through the month of July. Then on July 30th, we were in a battalion operation where we were surrounding a huge village, and we were taken there in helicopters. I swear it was still dark, and we set up, and we were around, and again, this is all described every day is described in the book. It was early morning, the sun was coming up. We were in this perimeter, huge perimeter, probably 200-300 guys around this. That's how big this village was. Well, obviously at that time of the morning, nature called, so I had to go off to the little outside the perimeter, and as soon as I squatted down to do my duty, I hear something, and there's a grenade. Luckily, I was behind a hedgerow, and the hedgerows were really thick. I mean, they were, and it didn't make it over the hedgerow. It went into the hedgerow, so it went off, and I got some shrapnel on my arm. But I was extremely lucky.
And the most vulnerable time.
Yes, yeah, right. But we had been so banged up already that month and all. The medic just wrapped me up, said, "You're good to go," and said, "I'll get you a tetanus shot." So the next time a bird came out, they gave me a tetanus shot and stuck me in the arm and just kept right on going.
Was there small arms fire that accompanied that, or was it just somebody?
No,
somebody just heard you moving and
right.
tossed a grenade in your way. And...
Right. Now there were reports that there were Viet Cong in this village. So anything, I didn't go that far off of the perimeter, but I went far enough that wherever, there could have been somebody there trying to take But usually they would just hit and run. They didn't stay and fight most of the time, unless they had advantage of numbers.
What are the chances it happened when you're doing?
I know. So, and because nobody, I mean, we had been so chewed up, and this was really relatively minor. Nobody made any big deal of it or anything. I didn't know anything. We didn't get back to the base camp till maybe the middle of August or later, and I walk in and there's the Purple Heart is sitting on my bunk. I didn't. And again, that had to do a lot with your first sergeant who was back at the base and recording and reporting, and your lieutenant. They are the ones that submitted the records. So anyway, that's how that ended up. I did mention before about the air medal, which I did want to get in here. At the time, the way it was explained to me anyway, the requirements for an air medal was that you got an air medal from 25 drops out of a helicopter while taking fire. Now, in most of those cases, you're a full 80 to 100 pounds on your back, you have your rifle, and you jump out of the airplane, out of the helicopter. The helicopters never landed. They'd come and they'd hover a very few seconds, and you'd flop out, boom, and off they'd go, because that's their most vulnerable time. Even to small gunfire, they could hit they could hit a blade and be done. So my exit interview was in July, the day before I left Vietnam. The guy doing my interview is taking down all my information, and he looks up and with a straight face, as serious as could be, he says, "Oh, you really should consider re-upping." I said, "What?" He said, "Well, yeah." He said, "You have 42 drops," which meant that he said, "If you get 8 more, you'll get a second medal." That's exactly how he said it. I said, "Well, I'm going home tomorrow. I'm not interested." And so that's why I kind of think that the air medal is kind of a big deal.
Yeah. So how much time did you have in country?
I was only there from July to March. So July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March. 9 months.
And why? Typically they did a year, right?
Yes, so that's a whole nother story. That's very interesting. By the beginning of 1970, the Army was cutting back. They were really pulling troops out of Vietnam, and they wanted to do it fast. So they came up with this policy that if you were going back to school, any kind of schooling at all, and you had a start date prior to your date that you would be discharged, you would be discharged to make that classroom date. So I already had my bachelor's degree. So I wrote home to my mother and sister, and they searched and searched, and I needed to find a graduate school that was on the quarter system, so that I'd get a starting date in March rather than in September, or the typical school year. So anyway, there's a whole slew of them. So anyway, I ended up getting accepted at Georgia State University in Atlanta, so that I had a starting date of I think it was like March 27th, 28th, something like that. So that meant that I had to leave Vietnam in time to get that date. So I ended up leaving Vietnam on March 25th. It's interesting that acrossed the international date line, got into California in the middle of the night on March 25th, because you pick up time. The only thing I remember about being discharged from the Army is we landed in Fort Ord, California, got off, and I believe it was a commercial airliner, huge and full of nothing but Vietnam vets. They marched us through an airplane hangar. I can remember going down this line, and in less than an hour, when we got to the other end of the line, we were out of the Army. And they put us back on an airplane and flew us to where we had to go. Well, I was supposed to be going to Atlanta, Georgia, because in a day or two, I was supposed to be sitting in a graduate class. While we're in flight, there's a snowstorm on the East Coast. I ended up landing in New York City. Now, the ironic part about that is I'm from Trenton, New Jersey, which is 50, 60 miles from New York City. My parents and my two sisters, who lived in New Jersey, had driven to Atlanta, Georgia to meet me. Now, there were no cell phones in those days, so they had no idea that my plane was being diverted from Atlanta to New York. So there was a 24-hour period where they're sitting in Atlanta airport having no idea where I am or what's going on. So anyway, they landed us in New York in a snowstorm and nothing. We had to walk, and I don't know if you're familiar with New York, but at the time, the terminals were very far apart. And they landed us in one terminal and we had to walk to another terminal, and you had to kind of make your own way. But anyway, it all worked out. But so about 2 days after I left Vietnam, I was sitting in a classroom as a graduate student in Atlanta. So that was one experience. And another thing I remember, because while the food and everything was really great in Vietnam, we got a hot meal almost every day by helicopter, except when the weather messed them up. But there were certain things you just didn't get, like pizza or, So I can remember less than a week being home. I went to this pizza place, and I think they're still in existence in Atlanta. It's called Shakey's, and it was basically for kids. And the kids used to get balloons when they went in. So I was oblivious to all that. So I'm sitting at this little table by myself, and a kid at the next table pops a balloon. I'm flat on the floor under the table. Of course, nobody knows because they kind of look at you like, "What's wrong with you?" But and all I did, so as soon as I realized what was going on, I just brushed myself up, got up, and kept eating my pizza. But it sounded like gunshot, And I mean, little things like that you had to kind of overcome. Took a little bit longer to acclimate yourself back,
Let's go back. I got a few questions.
Sure.
And then I want to go back to your homecoming. So, you guys are doing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Rosemary? Well, she'll catch on. Ro, are you there? All right. I'm still in the interview. Yeah, no, I won't be long. Yes, yeah, okay. Right, bye-bye. Sorry about that.
No worries. So
they're outside.
On patrol,
Yeah.
you mentioned you guys would lay ambushes at night. Obviously, some guys are getting shut-eye. Like, what's the living conditions when you're basically under a poncho liner and making the best of?
Basically, yes. You just laid right, or you slept right on the ground. Most of the time, it was very hot. Poncho liners are very hot. You didn't use a. You didn't really use a poncho liner. I get the green things. I just bought one because they're fantastic. They were good because even though it was hot, there were some times when it got cold. Not brutally cold, but cold enough, But most of the time, you just laid right on the ground. Depending on the area that you were in, during the day you would dig a foxhole, but you wouldn't sleep in the foxhole. You'd sleep next to the foxhole. So if mortars started coming in, you just rolled into the hole. That was one of my first experiences.
What about critters? You running into snakes, spiders, all that kind of stuff?
No. Again, we were along the coast, so I didn't find too much of that. There were a couple operations where we went into the mountains, but we were always on the move. And when we were in the mountains, you would sleep in a hammock sometimes, particularly if I remember some guys that got sick in the mountains, the dysentery, terrible, and we would have them sleep in hammocks, and because they were really. We had one operation where we went. I actually think we were in Laos, and we weren't supposed to be, but they never said that. I think we went to the field with, it was a big battalion operation. We went to the field with over 300 guys, and about 150 to 200 of them came back with dysentery. It was a mess. Not to be vulgar about it, but it was like a 3 or 4 day operation, and we were going up and down mountains like nothing, rain and all this. But it was so bad, and you couldn't stop. Literally, you tore a hole in your pants and you kept on going because stuff kept running out of you.
Terrible. Communicate with your family. How are you communicating with your family?
Basically through letters. We did get every time we'd get food almost every day. You get mail call every day. I did make some tape recordings which I'd sent home. But it was mostly letters, and you'd get packages in the field, and people would, so one guy get a package, you'd share it because the next day a different guy, so you'd get cookie. I remember it's hard to explain. My mother sent a Christmas package once, the Christmas I was over there, and for whatever reason, I remember I loved peanuts. She had a can of peanuts in there and cookies and all this. She sent a bottle of aftershave lotion. Well, of course, the aftershave lotion broke. So it's saturated. I can remember eating peanuts that tasted like aftershave lotion, but we just ate everything. Yeah.
So obviously you're not on patrol all the time, so you have some downtime in the rear. Are you guys living in like GP medium tents?
All right, yeah, we did not have, we would be out, there were obviously fuller platoons to a unit, and I forget how the setup was, but you would rotate perimeter duty at the home base. But it would also, they had a schedule, but they never kept to the schedule, because if a unit got hit real hard and there was hardly any people left in the unit, they would pull them back, set them up on the perimeter, and then resupply them. So the majority of the time we were in the field, I'd say maybe on an average of, if I was there 9 months, I'd say maybe we pulled 3 or 4 perimeter duties, and you'd only be on that perimeter for maybe a week to 10 days, and then somebody else would come in, depending on how it was hit. In January, right after the New Year, January 2nd, I believe, we were on the LZ Gator perimeter, and we got hit by snipers, and I lost a guy at that time. They blew up his bunker. But most of the living conditions, we were out in the field, just in the elements. When we were back at base camp, we did have, I don't know whether we called them hooches or what. They weren't exactly tents, but they weren't exactly buildings. They were very, and like, as I remember, all of the, like the E1s, E2s, E3s, and E4s were in like one big building, and we had, like on the end of that, we had a little subsection. We were kind of separated by ourselves. So when we were there, your days were pretty free, but you were sleeping because you were up all night on perimeter patrol.
Your homecoming, you already mentioned some of it. I've heard many different stories. I've heard some Vietnam veterans saying that they had really bad experiences. I heard others saying they had the problems? What was your personal experience?
I had no problems, but you knew that you didn't make a big deal of it. I don't think, but as I look back on it, probably because I had gone to the South, they were much, I think, even to today, the southern states are more military oriented. But I'd say probably most of the people that I was in class with, which it was a graduate class, so there were kind of various ages. They weren't all real young. They probably didn't even know that I'd been in the military. Never made a big deal of it. I did join the American Legion when I came home because my father had been in the American Legion. My grandfather was a commander in the American Legion, so it was kind of expected. I never really was very active. I did, from the first couple of years, because I was a teacher, I would talk to different American Legion groups who at that time were mostly World War II guys, and they had no concept of the war the way we fought it because theirs was a land war, and they really didn't get the concept of just not taking land and moving on, you know. So I explained that to them, and I had taken a lot of, in those days they were video slides, you know, slide projector that I had. So I'd show slides of the way the war was. I never took shots of actual fighting. In other words, I'd show airplanes and I'd show villages and talk about how the people lived and all that. But so.
Okay, so I got a couple final questions.
Sure, that's all right.
You're here today at World War II weekend. There's a lot of young kids that are here, and you have a hat on. Shows
Right.
Obviously you're a veteran. If you had a young man or a young woman come up to you today and chat you up and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about enlisting in the U.S. Army," what advice would you give them on how to succeed in the military?
Well, I haven't had anybody do that today. If they were interested in the Army, or in the military, I would say investigate it, find out, you know, what it is before you sign up. But if that's what you want to do, it could be a good life. It wasn't something that I was interested in because I'd already kind of had my life planned out. But for somebody that's young and doesn't have any experience and is kind of, you know, wondering what to do, they should investigate it. It's not a bad life if you have the right personality. You got to be willing to take orders and, you know, follow rules. But now, one of the people that I'm with, she has a fascinating story. She Yes, she actually, well, I don't know whether they call it graduate, but she went to the Naval Academy, finished 4 years, was in 2 weeks of graduation. She'd already passed all her exams and everything, and was kicked out. And because she had been found to be dating an underclassman, and that was against the rules. So anyway, the long and short of it is that when they kicked her out, they told her she owed $175,000 for that. And so the only way she could pay that off was to get in the military. Well, none of the services would take her because she was kicked out. But the Army said to her, if you go into the National Guard and have a clean record, we'll take you. And see, she wanted to do that so she could work off her. So anyway, she did that. She is amazing. She's still in the National Guard. This is probably 10 years or so now that she was in the Army. She's airborne. She's PSYOP. She's been overseas on various missions that you don't know about. She's fantastic. She's really an amazing person. The Navy blew it because she's a natural born leader. She's just fabulous. So that's my experience of young people in the military, and that was a good one. It's a good one for her. And through her, I've met a lot of other, Army sort of misfits that have she's helped. She takes care of people. So yeah, no, as I say, the military is, it's not for everybody, but it's for a lot of people, and sometimes they don't even know it's for them until they, explore it and find out. So I would encourage, if you have that question, then I would encourage.
I got a last question. It's a good one. Brace yourself. So, obviously, we're recording the video right now. You're going to receive a copy. You're also going to receive instructions on how to submit your story to the Library of Congress Veterans History Project.
Okay.
Theoretically, your video will be there as long as we have a country. Your video will be there, so your great grandkid might stumble upon the video. What would you want them to know about your service to your country?
I'd have to think about it. Well, one thing I would want them to know is that I was very proud of what I did. I truly believe in the concept of democracy and defending it. Now, there's a whole hoopla about whether Vietnam was really defending democracy or what it was. That I shove that off on the political side view. In essence, I believe it was necessary, and I believe we did the best we could with what we had. And I would want them to know that whatever freedoms and life that they have really grew out of that experience, and I'm not ashamed of it at all. Which, when we came back, it was tough. I mean, you knew not to, and you could understand why. I mean, there were issues, but to me, that's all political, and it's a shame. I don't believe in war, and as I said before, I'm not a big fan of guns, but you just can never give in to bullies. I go back, to the in school you studied the Second World War, or at least I did, and you knew that's what that was. And this, as we got older, was our same experience, and we have the same experience today. Even though you can't fully understand it, and as an individual you feel you can't do anything about it, you can as a unified group, and I think that's what the military gives you, those leadership skills.
Well said. Well, on behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, I thank you for telling us your fascinating story. I learned a lot, and I think that you did a great job.
Well, thank you so much,
sir.
Greg. I appreciate it.